My name is Juliet Jeske. I run an account on Twitter called Decoding Fox News, where I break down disinformation and misleading stories on the Fox News network. Each week, I watch and analyze 15 hours of Fox News and then break it down. I watch all the Fox News you'd never want to. Normally, I put 2-minute long videos on Twitter. Normally, it's usually just clips of Fox News with some commentary, but this is a long-form video, the first I've tried. It's based on a 13.5-minute long monologue by Tucker Carlson. He gave this on May 18th. In this monologue, Tucker does something he does often, which is to take 3 different things and try to combine them as sort of related when they're not. The first is inflation, the second being the new White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, and the third being racism, because why not? Just throw racism in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play through this monologue. I won't show you the whole thing because it's quite long, but I will break it down, and in between clips, I'll explain what he's doing.
Believe it or not, in 1980, which wasn't that long ago, Venezuela was the richest country in Latin America. It had the highest wages, it had the best health care and education. It also had, by the standards of the region anyway, a famously stable democracy. Then came an energy crisis, and Venezuela wound up with inflation. At times, it reached 100% a year. Inflation makes people poor, so in a very short time, the poverty rate in Venezuela doubled. By 1995, 66% of all Venezuelans were impoverished. Getting poorer tends to make voters radical, so inevitably Venezuela got radical politics. You know what happened next. Venezuela is now rated one of the most miserable places on planet Earth. A few years ago, citizens in Caracas were reduced to eating zoo animals. There was no food, and for that matter, there was no electricity. So in just half a lifetime, an advanced society had reverted to the Stone Age.
So that's kind of typical of Tucker Carlson. He uses hyperbole quite a bit. He goes from all the way from no electricity to the Stone Age, which is a bit extreme because electricity hasn't been around that long. But okay, Tucker, sure, the Stone Age. He also leaves out quite a bit about the history of the Venezuelan country, the fact that their entire economy is based on oil, and the government before Chavez and now Maduro was pretty corrupt, which is part of the reason why people did get radicalized. It wasn't just inflation.
Once you get inflation, there's no pretending you've done a good job. You have not done a good job, and everybody knows it. So you can see why the Biden administration is very worried about this. Joe Biden has historically low approval ratings. Voters say inflation is their top concern. Those two facts are directly related.
So this is where Tucker makes the first kind of crazy shift. It's perfectly legitimate to talk about inflation. Inflation is indeed a problem. Pretty much in every democracy, when there's high inflation, if the leadership is able to be voted out, they are voted out by the people. That's how powerful inflation is. It's not popular, and it is extremely problematic. Completely legit. I'm with you, Tucker. But when you make a shift to the new White House press secretary, you're going strange places. And that's exactly what he does, in that he suddenly shifts and pivots after about 2.5 minutes to Karine Jean-Pierre, as if somehow she's connected to rising costs. She's not, but here we go.
So Biden's most pressing task right now is reassuring Americans that he understands their suffering under inflation and under a rapidly worsening economy, and that he's got a plan to fix it. If he can't convince Americans of that, it may be a long time before we have another Democratic president. Thankfully, Joe Biden has a plan, or at least a new publicist, a silver-tongued wordsmith/policy guru called Karine Jean-Pierre. It is Karine Jean-Pierre's job to take this message of economic hope to the American people and save the Biden administration. She started Monday. Here were her first words from the podium.
I am obviously acutely aware that my presence at this podium represents a few firsts. I am a Black, gay, immigrant woman, the first of all 3 of those to hold this position.
So that was a little confusing. It wasn't actually about America, it was about her. But still, we learned that Karine Jean-Pierre is a Black lesbian, the first ever in history, she reminded us, to hold this particular job.
So if you can see in that clip, Tucker Carlson gets incredibly angry with Karine Jean-Pierre because she stated the obvious, that she's the first Black, female, queer White House press secretary in the history of the United States. Tucker has a pattern with this, in that he also went against Ketanji Brown Jackson for being the first black woman to be nominated to the Supreme Court. That got him really worked up, and he reduced both her gender and her race simply to appearance. Tucker Carlson, again, is connecting inflation to Karine Jean-Pierre, which is odd, because all she is the press secretary. She speaks on behalf of the president. She has no actual power over policy, and she has no control over inflation, which at the current moment is a global problem due to COVID-19. But again, he still has to make that leap. So Tucker goes on about inflation for about 3 minutes, which again is fair because inflation is a problem. Although he does have some misleading things about energy in his little rant there, but it's not worth breaking that down because I'm trying to show these crazy leaps that he makes.
So this has never happened. It's happening now. Why? Why is this happening?
So the next leap that he's about to make is again to Karine Jean-Pierre. Why? I'm not sure. He just decides that somehow inflation is her responsibility, or the fact that she talks about any other issue in the United States is she's ignoring inflation. She's not ignoring inflation. No one's ignoring inflation. You can look to any news source right now, and inflation is going to be pretty top on that list. Pretty much every other story is about inflation or gas prices or whatever. But again, why not? Let's just talk about the White House press secretary. She's a black woman. She's gay. That's fodder for Tucker Carlson.
That's shocking. But if you're upset about it, we'd like you to pause and return your attention to the fact, and we're going to say this slowly so it can sink in, our new White House press secretary is a black lesbian. Oh, hooray! The White House press corps was duly impressed, tamed, in fact, which was the point of telling them that. But our Peter Doocy did have one question. What is the Biden administration doing about our collapsing economy? And how exactly is the plan to increase taxes on American citizens going to help them pay for things? Now, you wouldn't have thought it was possible to take talking points that stupid, that barely literate, that childish, and make them even dumber. And yet that's exactly what she did.
Okay, so Tucker Carlson just called a grown woman childish. Kind of a problem there, Tucker. And one thing I just want to point out, that it took me a few, dozen hours to hear him talk before I picked up on his affectation of how he says, rather.
Did that rattle your confidence rather than bolster it?
It's slight, but you'll hear it. Rather. He says rather. And he also says poor, 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 which is actually the correct pronunciation, but most Americans don't use it. Anyway, so Tucker Carlson calling a grown woman a child, basically, indirectly. And then he goes on about how she is somehow responsible for Biden's response to inflation. But she doesn't actually have any control, and she doesn't have any power. So she flubs on an answer or doesn't do her best job when responding to a reporter. It does not mean that somehow that affects the policy of President Joe Biden. Now things get really weird when good old Tuck goes on a rant about racism. Okay, and now I had trouble following this too, because I was like, why are we talking about the press secretary? And why are we talking about racism?
And honestly, there's nothing we can do for you at this point. You're beyond reach. In fact, you know what you are, and you may have seen this coming? You're a racist. That's what we call people who continue to ask complicated, long questions about Joe Biden's economic program. They're racists, and getting rid of them is America's greatest problem.
Okay. Trust me, it's hard to watch these things. Okay, so Tucker is basically saying that Karine Jean-Pierre, who's merely a mouthpiece for the president, nothing more, she has no power, is somehow responsible for the fact that there are other issues in the United States besides inflation. I don't really know what he's going with this. And that somehow, if you care about inflation, she or someone else will call you racist. Now, this is a journey, and it doesn't make a ton of sense, but what he's about to show are clips of other journalists talking about the shooting in Buffalo. You know, the mass shooting that was 2 weeks ago rather than last week. I wish I was kidding on that one. But they're talking about the racially motivated shooting in Buffalo. And a couple of them say Republican. That's it. That's all that you see. You see reporters talking about a racially motivated shooting in Buffalo. And Tucker, I cannot make this up, ties those clips back to Karine Jean-Pierre and inflation. I'll just play parts of it because it's so bonkers.
Here's MSNBC to remind you.
Mitch McConnell won't come close to delivering the condemnation of white supremacy that Joe Biden did today. Because what? Because they make up part of the Republican coalition? I mean, what is the explanation for why not?
This is always what the right does to appease the white supremacist movement by saying, hey, free speech. Don't touch speech.
Extremism and white nationalism, which is not only on the rise in the far dark corners on the internet, but the rhetoric in a tamer version, an attenuated version, I say, is now pretty mainstream in the Republican Party.
Did you hear that from the comb-over guy? Free speech is white supremacy, says Chuck Todd. It's white supremacy, free speech. Talking out of turn, reading your own script rather than the one that Chuck Todd provides you is white supremacy.
Rather. He says rather.
And that means if you're upset about food shortages or blackouts, you're a racist. Racist, racist, racist.
Okay, so his "you're a racist" goes on for 2 minutes, where he shows these clips that have nothing to do with inflation and nothing to do with Karine Jean-Pierre. They have to do with a racially motivated hate crime. That goes on for 2 minutes. And then he talks about inflation again for 1 minute and literally alludes to the end of civilization. No biggie. And then, for reasons that do not make sense, like it's hard to watch this stuff, he then goes on a 1 minute rant about Karine Jean-Pierre by showing, get this, clips of Karine Jean-Pierre talking about then President Donald J. Trump. And she calls Donald J. Trump a racist. And in one clip, she calls Fox News racist, which is her opinion. She's entitled to it. There's this thing called the First Amendment. Now, these clips are from 2016 to 2020. What year is it, Tucker?
It's like the First Amendment. It's white supremacy. And if you don't believe it, Karine Jean-Pierre is here to remind you.
Donald Trump is running a racist campaign. The grand wizard of the birther movement, which birtherism is inherently racist. By the way, he's a racist and a bigot, which we already knew. Walks like a racist, talks like a racist, acts like a racist. It is a racist. And we saw all these awful voter suppression laws, which is really racism just across the country.
Now, what was Karine Jean-Pierre? What did she do for a job from 2016 to 2020? She was a pundit. And a pundit is someone that freely expresses their political opinions. Freely. That's what they do. That's what their job is. They're not a journalist. They're a pundit. So a pundit is allowed to go ahead and let their freak flag fly and say, I believe in this policy or that policy, and calling the then president of the United States racist was her opinion, and she's entitled to it. Pundit. He somehow tries to take her calling the then president, Donald J. Trump, a racist, and link it to inflation in 2022. And somehow, if you disagree with her, you are a racist. That's exactly what Tucker Carlson does in this monologue. Whew, I had to watch this thing 3 times and then break it down in a list to make any sense of it. Let me just play the ending for you.
You know, we need to talk about Karine Jean-Pierre just told. You know what we need to have a conversation about? And by conversation, we mean you shut up, I talk. We need to have a conversation about how racist you are, which is very racist. So if you can't keep the lights on or go to the dentist, or if you're one of the very few people, maybe 3 in the country, who's noticed that honey prices have doubled since December, why is that happening? Shut up, racist.
So to recap, and I'm putting on my readers because I'm Gen X. Okay. You'll find out when you're older. Okay, here we go. So for 2.5 minutes, Tucker Carlson talks about inflation. Again, fair. Then switches to Karine Jean-Pierre for 1.5 minutes, switches back to inflation for 3 minutes, goes back to Karine Jean-Pierre for 2 minutes, then shows completely unrelated clips about a racially motivated hate crime for 2 minutes, goes back to inflation, goes back to Karine Jean-Pierre for 1 minute each, and then ends it with, you're a racist. So somehow he's taking all of this mess, including the first black female queer press secretary, and trying to mold it into a crazy, you're a racist mix if you don't think Joe Biden is handling inflation. I know, my head hurts too. Woo! That is kind of unusual for a Tucker Carlson monologue in that it was so insane, but not that unusual. So if you like this video and want to see more videos like this, most of my videos are quite short and I don't appear in them. I do this every week. No, really, I do. Okay, so if you want to see more videos that I curate, you can go to Decoding Fox News. I also have a Substack channel where I do a weekly newsletter and podcast that are completely free for anyone to listen to or read. And that's about it. So again, I watch all the Fox News you'd never want to. I'm Juliet Jeske.